Good morning. The House Energy Communications and Technology Committee will come to order. Madam Clerk, will you please take the roll call?
Chair Scott,
Present.
Representatives Andrews,
Present.
Coleman,
Here.
Witsit,
Here.
Neely,
Here.
Burns,
Here.
Churches,
Present.
Hill,
Here.
McDonald,
Here.
McFall,
Here.
Wenzel,
Here.
Outman,
Here.
Aragona,
Here.
DeGole,
Here.
Green,
Here.
Preston,
Here.
Schmaltz.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have 17 members present. You have a quorum.
Perfect, thank you. We need a motion to adopt the minutes from the February 1st, 2023 meeting. Okay. Vice Chair Wenzel, thank you. All right. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's committee meeting, Dan Scripps, Chair of the Michigan Public Service Commission. Can you please come forward? Hello.
Chairwoman Scott, Vice Chairs Andrews and Wenzel, members of the House Energy Communications and Technology Committee. My name is Dan Scripps, and I serve as Chair of the Michigan Public Service Commission. And I want to provide you today with a brief overview of utility regulation and the work of the Commission. This could be a lot longer than we're going to spend today on this, and so it really is just a high-level overview to scratch the surface of some of the current issues and hot topics in utility regulation. And of course, I and my fellow commissioners and our staff stand ready and willing to have additional conversations as you get into specifics. My goal is to take maybe 25 minutes at the beginning to sort of tee up some of these issues and then leave the rest of the session for any questions that the members have. I want to start at a really high level in terms of why we regulate at all. Traditional utility services like electricity, natural gas, landline telephone, and water are natural monopolies, and we subject these monopolies to regulation because we believe that left unchecked, natural monopolies will act in a way that is inconsistent with the public interest. In an important sense, regulation is a proxy for the competitive market. But it's also important to remember that traditional utilities are highly capital intensive with a high fixed cost and high barrier to entry. The more customers they serve, the less it costs to serve these customers because the fixed costs are spread across a broader base. It's also more cost effective for a utility to operate in a 1 mile area and serve 100 customers than it is to serve a 1 mile area with 10 customers. So at the turn of the 20th century, electric companies were vying for customers in high density, high income areas and often leaving rural and poorer areas unserved. At the same time, it's inefficient to have 10 sets of wires or pipelines running through a city. This can drive up costs for customers while continuing to leave many customers without access to service. So in the early 1900s, the idea of a utility regulator was born and the regulatory compact began to take hold. In exchange for a government grant of exclusive service territories, the electric utilities and natural gas utilities agreed to government regulation of their rates and profits and incurred an obligation to serve all the customers in that service territory who are willing to take their service. Further, to avoid the inherent tendency of monopolies to take advantage of their monopoly status, these companies became subject to regulation by state utility regulators, which approve the rates they can charge, promulgate rates around service quality, and ensure compliance with utility of codes of conduct designed to limit anti-competitive behavior. In Michigan, it's the Michigan Public Service Commission that serves as this role, but only for investor-owned electric and gas utilities and incumbent telephone providers. For municipally owned utilities like the Marquette Board of Light and Power and the Wyandotte Municipal Services, we have much less of a role as these utilities are part of and are regulated by their local units of government. Similarly, cooperative utilities such as Midwest Energy and Communications and the Alger Delta Electric, or Cooperative Electric Association, there you are governed by boards of directors elected by the co-op's members, and I know Representative Preston has served as one of those board members for the Alger Delta Co-op for a number of years. And notably, those distinctions and the roles and responsibilities of the Public Service Commission come from you, the legislature. So this is a really important piece because in any conversation about what the commission is, should be, or could be doing, it's important to understand the framework within which the commission operates. We are a creature of statute. In our meetings that I've had with a number of you, I think all of you have heard me say that because we take it really seriously. We have only the authority provided by the legislature. So everything we do as it regulates to the regulation of utilities must be rooted in our statutory authority. We do not have common law or equity powers. That said, we do have a fairly broad grant of authority from the legislature under Michigan Compiled Laws Section 460.6, which provides that the Commission has broad jurisdiction to regulate investor-owned electric and natural gas utilities and can regulate all rates, fares, fees, charges, services, rules, conditions of service, and other matters of formation, operation, and direction of the utilities. The Commission also has power and jurisdiction to hear and pass upon all matters pertaining to, necessary, or incident to the regulation of the utilities. This is, as I said, fairly broad, though the courts have stepped in and limited our authority in some pretty impactful ways. Specifically, the Commission does not have the authority to make management decisions for the utilities. We can decide whether expenditures made in accordance with those management decisions are reasonable and prudent, and therefore eligible for recovery from their customers, but we don't substitute our managerial decisions for those made by the utility. And then one other note about how we work. We are a quasi-judicial body, much like a court, when we're deciding contested cases. And in fact, in Virginia and some other states, public service commissioners are actually referred to as judges. As such, we are subject to the same ex parte rules as judges that prevent us from discussing open cases before us. So, given that our authority comes only from the legislature, I think it's important to talk about sort of how that evolution progressed over our history. We are today celebrating, although some might take issue with the term celebration, 150 years of utility regulation in Michigan. It is our sesquicentennial. We were formed as the Michigan Railroad Commission in 1873, established by the legislature, with one commissioner to regulate railroad rates and conditions of service. In 1909, the legislature expanded the body to 3 members and gave the commission authority to regulate electric rates and terms of service. In 1911, we added telephone service, and in 1919, the Railroad Commission was abolished and replaced with the Public Utilities Commission, adding natural gas and steam. 10 years later, we added natural gas and petroleum pipelines, and then in 1939, really the foundational statute for us, Public Act 3, abolished the Public Utilities Commission and established the Public Service Commission. We added, and there are a number of pieces that are included in that as well. We've added along the way other pieces, and the term we like to use is that the legislature giveth and the legislature taketh away. So at different times, we've regulated motor carrier services, we've regulated water services, we've even regulated the ferry that serves Hanson's Island in northern Lake St. Clair, but none of those are current areas of our jurisdiction. More recently, we've seen the addition of gas safety standards, the enforcement mechanisms and penalties for violation of those standards, emergency planning responsibilities, an overhaul of telecommunications, electric industry restructuring in 2000 that led to full customer choice and the divestment of transmission assets. In 2008, we re-regulated 90% of the market, but preserved 10% of retail open access. We created the first renewable portfolio standard, and I'm saying you created the first renewable portfolio standard, required investor-owned utilities to establish net metering programs, and added energy efficiency programs. And then in 2016, the most recent overhaul, we addressed long-term planning proceedings and electric capacity resource adequacy, increased the renewable portfolio standard to 15% by 2021, included a sunset for the energy waste reduction programs for municipal and cooperative utilities in 2021, added a requirement for investor-owned utilities to offer voluntary green pricing programs, and switched from net metering to a cost-based distributed generation tariff framework. And that's really where things stand today. So in terms of just a very high-level overview of the market structure and current legal framework, as I said, 90% monopoly service for investor-owned utilities in the service territory with 10% choice or retail open access. Choice customers may select their provider. Distribution service continues to be provided by the incumbent utility, and the Commission's role is fairly limited. We require the licensing of alternative electric suppliers, but we don't regulate their rates. In terms of the resource requirements and targets, again, a 15% requirement for renewable energy by 2021, 1% annual energy waste reduction. That sunset for municipal and cooperative utilities in 2021 continues for investor-owned electric utilities. It's a 0.75 annual standard for natural gas utilities. And the 2016 law also included a goal of getting 35% of our electricity from a combination of renewable energy and energy waste reduction. Under long-range planning, this has been something that we've really spent a lot of time with. The integrated resource planning provisions of the 2016 laws require filing of these integrated resource plans every 5 years, a whole series of statutory items that must be included in the plans in terms of how the utilities are going to meet their peak load. And then importantly, it's not just one factor that we look at in evaluating the reasonableness and prudence of those plans, but a statutory framework that requires us to balance things like pricing, reliability, environmental compliance, diversity of generation supply, and other statutory factors. And then in addition, because only the investor-owned utilities are filing these integrated resource plans, we require all electric providers, including municipal utilities, cooperative utilities, and alternative electric suppliers, to show that they have the capacity to serve expected demand 4 years into the future. The result of some of these changes is an energy system that's very much in transition. So when you look at 2007, the year before Public Acts 286 and 295, we were heavily reliant, almost 60% on coal resources, 11% natural gas, 26% nuclear, 3% renewables and energy waste reduction, and about 1% from other sources. Now, in truth, it wasn't just the passage of the laws that changed this. We knew at the time that many of the coal assets were reaching the end of their useful lives, and the question at that time was how to replace them. And so Governor Granholm tasked Peter Lark, my predecessor as chair of the commission, with developing the 21st Century Energy Plan, and utilities argued that the restructuring in 2000 made it much, much more difficult to make the large-scale investments in new generation assets. And so one goal of the 2008 reforms was to return 90% of the market to the utilities to give them that certainty while also jump-starting renewable energy and energy efficiency. And I think the results speak for themselves. We've seen coal's share of the generation mix cut in half, essentially, between 2007 and 2021. Natural gas doubling from 11% to 2021, and a significant increase to from 3% in 2007 to 24% in 2021 in the share represented by energy efficiency and renewable energy. And we expect those trends to continue looking out to 2025 and beyond, but importantly, and I think critically importantly, all while maintaining the grid scale reliability and resource adequacy we've come to expect. On the natural gas side, it's a lighter touch because we do have supplier choice on the gas side. There are distribution monopolies with 10 natural gas distribution companies that are subject to rate regulation by the Commission, and customers can either choose to get their natural gas from those incumbent distribution companies, or they can purchase their gas from an alternative gas supplier. Alternative gas suppliers are licensed by the Commission, similar to alternative electric suppliers, but we do not have jurisdiction over their rates. And then finally, on telecommunications, a number of things, but largely telecommunications, important to know, is primarily open competition with minimal MPSC regulation or oversight. The primary focus in the telecommunications space is in enabling effective competition. I'd also add, not an area that we regulate, but we also play an important market monitoring and energy security function over things like propane, petroleum, and gasoline. This includes summer and winter energy appraisals to provide additional information to customers. In the winter, we typically focus on propane and other delivered fuels, as well as natural gas for heating. And in the summer, as we think about traveling all over our beautiful state, we do an assessment of expected gasoline prices as well as electric load for air conditioning. And then we also have energy emergency responsibilities, including advising in emergency situations. We have a seat on the statewide Emergency Operations Center, and also work pretty assiduously to avoid emergencies through planning and the like. All of which brings me to the commission today. So there are 3 commissioners. Each of us serves 6-year staggered terms. We are appointed by the governor with advice and consent from the state Senate. no more than 2 of us can be members of the same political party. And there are strict ethical provisions, and all of these things are designed to provide a degree of commission independence in doing our jobs. We are supported by an independent professional staff with expertise across the full range of issues that we focus on: engineering law, finance, economics, auditing, accounting, customer service, complaint issues, etc. And I will say I am fortunate to serve both with my 2 outstanding fellow commissioners, Commissioner Tremaine Phillips and Commissioner Catherine Paratic, each of whom are national experts across a range of issues, as well as our staff. Our staff is, I jumped ahead, but our staff is divided into a number of specific divisions, and one important piece about how the Commission does its work is that in contested cases, our staff is always party to the case, representing the public interest and bringing their expertise to bear. And as a result of that, in contested cases, they are actually independent from the Commission. We don't tell them what to testify, what arguments to make. In fact, we are not allowed to talk to them during the pendency of contested cases, and this preserves a level of independence so that we have record evidence that's really based in engineering, finance, economics, et cetera, that we then are able to draw from in making our decisions. And that level of independence and expertise is truly invaluable in serving the people of Michigan. I'd also flag that this organizational chart looks a little different than it has in previous years. We undertook last year an effort to really modernize our organization in order to keep pace with the changes taking place in the industries that we regulate. So as we continue to see transformation in both the telecommunications and energy space, we wanted to make sure that our organization was reflecting those changes. We've taken on, in the last couple of years, a number of important initiatives. Following the polar vortex in 2019, the governor tasked us with developing a statewide energy assessment that was issued in September of 2019. I would still today flag this as an invaluable resource. It continues to be available on our website, but it really covered a broad range of issues, including the supply, engineering, and deliverability of natural gas, electricity, and propane, as well as contingency planning relating to those systems. We came up with 37 recommendations, things that we could change within our regulatory framework, and then 15 observations for work that was beyond our control but could be subject to the legislature or our regional transmission operators. And we did not leave it on the shelf. This has become a roadmap for our work over the last several years. And in 2021, we provided an update that we showed that we had completed 18 of the items, 17 recommendations where work was ongoing, where unlikely to have an end date, 22 items that were in progress, significant steps had been made, and 2 where work still hadn't begun. And our staff continues to work on these issues to try and ensure that we're learning the lessons of 2019 and more recent events to make our system as resilient as it possibly can be. Also in 2019, we launched the My Power Grid initiative, which is a focused multi-year stakeholder initiative to maximize the benefits of the transition to clean distributed energy resources for Michigan residents and businesses. And when we describe this, we often talk about a bus. We are not driving the bus in terms of the changes that are taking place in the energy space. But we also want to make sure that we're not run over by the bus. And so it's important that we continue to reform and modernize our regulatory framework to keep pace with these changes. And the My Power Grid initiative in particular focuses on the areas of customer engagement, integrating emerging technologies, and optimizing grid investments. A whole series of specific work groups and additional items that are included under that. And the focus is not shiny reports or in-depth studies. It is how do we take those things and then effectuate them through orders, rulemakings, and the like to make sure that we're as prepared as we can be. We've also spent a lot of time recently on reliability concerns. This is something that I think is probably clear to most of you from the places that you call home, but our reliability at the distribution network isn't where it needs to be. We've, to be clear, made some significant improvements in recent years, I saw a press release from Consumers Energy that their reliability issues were down, the outages down 20% last year. I think we're starting to see the benefits anecdotally and at a system level of some of the changes that have taken place. But we also know that there's more that needs to be done. And so after the really difficult storm season in the summer of 2021, and then again after some really devastating storms at the end of the summer of 2022, we issued storm orders, and as part of that called for technical conferences on reliability and also launched an independent third-party audit into distribution systems to really get our hands and arms around what needs to be done. What do we not know that other utilities are doing that have resulted in better performance? And the goal here is not blame. I have zero interest in that. I want solutions, and so that's the focus of this effort, and we have an RFP going out literally this month to find an independent contractor to perform that audit. And then finally, on resource adequacy, there are concerns that as the system continues to evolve, how do we keep the lights on? And so both at the state level with the capacity demonstrations and integrated resource plans and some other efforts, as well as our active participation with our regional transmission operators, that's MISO for most of Michigan, and then PJM for the southwest portion of the Lower Peninsula, working closely with them to address long-term resource adequacy issues. All of that, the statutory direction and framework that's developed by the legislature, the initiatives that we've undertaken, the work regionally and in-state, sort of rolls up into how we define our major functions. And I want to walk through each of these fairly quickly at a high level, and then I'll close and open it up for discussion. In terms of ensuring system reliability, some of our current efforts are the third-party audit that I mentioned, significant investments that we've approved for tree trimming and grid hardening, updating rules for service quality technical standards and interconnection that are currently with JCAR, and technical conferences on the role of energy storage resources and batteries to enhance system resilience at the distribution level. The issues to note, again, we are unwavering in our focus on reliability. It has been a consistent focus over the last several years and across multiple iterations of the Commission. And also, we have worked on distribution planning. Utilities filed, most utilities at this point, electric utilities, file 5-year distribution plans that helps with greater transparency. But additional transparency in this area could continue to help with modernization efforts and preparing for and leveraging the benefits of EV adoption. On just and reasonable rates, current efforts are really grounded in the requirement that rates reflect cost of service, and they need to reflect cost of service by rate class. Residential customers pay for residential use, commercial customers for commercial use, industrial customers for commercial use. This is, by law, those rates must be set at a level that allows a utility to recover their reasonably and prudently incurred costs, along with an opportunity to earn a fair return on their investment. And that's really the sort of bedrock that we look at. That also plays into emerging issues like what rates should we set for electric vehicle programs or for utility distributed generation tariffs required under the 2016 laws. A number of utilities have adopted time-based pricing programs. It's now the default for consumers, and DTE and other utilities provide these programs on a voluntary basis. And last year, we upped our game, I would say, in terms of maintaining our competitiveness around rate structures for large industrial customers. A couple of issues to note. First, the distributed generation program compensation continues to be determined in contested cases based on the record evidence in front of us, as is required by law. I would say that we have a program that reflects the cost to serve customers, but it is something that continues to be litigated. And I know that that is integrally intertwined with the question that is a statutory question on the cap on participation in those distributed generation programs. We also understand that the allocation of costs among customer classes and energy burden, particularly for low-income customers, continues to be a significant issue. We've experimented largely through settlements in our cases with percentage of income pilot programs to address some of that energy burden. And I think that's consistent with some of the recommendations from the My Healthy Climate Plan that particularly for low-income individuals and families, that the ultimate bill is not more than 6% of somebody's income. There's a tension between that and cost of service principles, to be clear, but we're trying to be aware and move forward in terms of addressing energy burden. And then I'd just highlight that the statutory timelines for some of our issues, particularly in rate cases, is a significant challenge. I want to say very clearly that we've never missed a deadline, and it's really important that we don't, because if we do on a rate case, then the utility proposal as proposed is implemented. But it does require a fair amount of work to meet those deadlines, and it's something that we always flag when we're talking with the legislature. In terms of licensing and fostering competitive markets, the one thing I'd highlight on the licensing side is on telecommunications. As I said, we've got a light touch when it comes to telecommunication, but one thing that we do is licensing telecommunications providers, and that's a required step for those providers to leverage federal broadband funding, including through the Rural Development Opportunity Fund, or RDOF. And I would say that we've seen a range of applications, everything from folks who are coming in to try and serve underserved areas to groups like Midwest Energy and Communications, traditional electric co-op that is now offering broadband service, and that's true for some municipals as well, and even some of the satellite-based providers that are like Starlink that are looking at opportunities to serve unserved and underserved areas in Michigan. One issue to note is that we don't currently require licensing for demand response aggregators. So these are groups that can come in, work with folks who are willing to, in exchange for market signals, reduce their energy consumption at key times, and is a key energy capacity resource in the markets. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, the federal regulator, has said that we need to move in this direction, and our regional transmission organizations are moving in this direction as well. But we currently allow both for bundled load, the 90%, and for the choice market, aggregation of demand response for large industrial customers. We have not yet allowed for aggregation of smaller customers, and one of the reasons that we haven't is that we don't have the licensing in place that would give us some regulatory reach over some of those providers. In terms of energy assurance and planning, I've covered a lot of this in terms of really focused on resource adequacy and grid scale reliability. Mentioned that we've recently expanded the demand response aggregation to the bundled retail market, and also our work in conducting market monitoring of unregulated commodities, including a weekly survey that we do during the heating season of propane retailers. Two issues to note in this space is that the lack of timely propane data hampers emergency response. And this is not just for propane, but also for refineries like Marathon and others. And they provide this information on a regular basis to the federal government, but there is a significant and indeed growing lag in the time that we get that information that makes it challenging to respond to market disruptions in real time. And then I'd also highlight the need to focus on attributes as the system continues to evolve. We've replaced an awful lot of baseload power over the last 15 years with renewable energy resources that don't always run. And so how to think about the attributes that we've had and that we will continue to rely on, and whether that's natural gas peaking facilities or things like batteries at the grid scale, where there was even a pilot or a report done through the State Energy Office a couple of years ago, an energy storage roadmap that recommended some potential targets that could be considered in terms of how to integrate batteries into the system to maintain overall grid scale reliability. On facility siting and need determination, we review siting applications for a lot of infrastructure projects, including electric transmission, natural gas transmission at the intrastate level, starting and ending in Michigan, and then also for petroleum and other hazardous materials pipelines. We also assess the need for large-scale generation additions through either our IRPs or our Certificate of Need process. And so those are really what we do on facility siting and need determination. One thing that I think is important to note is that we don't have a role in the siting of generation projects. That takes place at the local level. And then finally, we're almost done. On public safety and infrastructure oversight, we've got a great relationship with MISTIG. We have a really top-notch team of pipeline safety inspectors and investigators who are out in the field all across the state. We also have, through our energy security group, we review utility cyber and physical security protections. That's obviously gotten a lot of attention in recent years, both on the cyber front, but with the attacks, physical attacks on grid infrastructure in North Carolina and Oregon and Washington in recent months, something that is increasingly important across the country. And in fact, I serve on a task force with 9 other state regulators and all 4 FERC commissioners, and the topic of our discussion next week is on physical security. So it's something that we really spend a lot of focus on. 2 issues to note in this area. One is that we, as I said, have a great gas safety team. But each year we get audited by our federal partners with PHMSA. And each year we get a very strong report card with one exception. And that is that we don't have adequate enforcement ability, finding authority for issues in the system. And each year the lack of that enforcement ability results in a loss of federal funding. So currently, when something like the Ray Compressor Station in Macomb County caught on fire a couple of years ago, our authority is limited, our enforcement authority is limited to $10,000 per incident. PHMSA would like to see that increase to $200,000 per incident. And that would get us additional federal funding and also provide additional protections for the public. And then there are additional protections as well needed for critical energy infrastructure information. I've had that conversation with a number of you, and it's something that we've flagged for the last couple of years. And then finally, on customer assistance and protection, we have a great customer assistance team. They handle complaints and inquiries from the public, often can turn around issues in the same day. Strongly encourage you to reach out to us if there are issues that you get calls about from your constituents, and we can help find those answers in addition to reaching out to the utilities directly. We also administer the MEEP program. That's $50 million a year in assistance. We administer that in partnership with DHHS and a network of grantees across the state. We've also created a low-income energy policy board and are working on an energy affordability and accessibility collaborative to really provide additional assistance for those who are struggling. And then 2 issues to note here. One is that as a result of continued high commodity costs and the expiration of federal funding, we have seen a pretty significant increase in need. In fact, the state emergency relief cases are up 60% this year compared to the average of the last couple of years. And also just to flag that the MEEP statute sunsets every couple of years, and it's due for a sunset this year. So sometime between now and the end of the fiscal year, we'll need to revisit that issue as well. And then finally, I forgot the slide was here. We are a creature of the legislature, and we've undertaken a number of legislative projects in the last couple of years. So the Senate, through a resolution in 2020, asked us to do a rate design study for distributed energy resources. That is done. Through legislation last year, we were tasked with doing a renewable natural gas study to look at the potential and constraints for renewable natural gas in Michigan and potential solutions. That is also done. We're continuing to work with the U.S. Department of Energy on a grid integration study as requested by Senate Resolution 143 of 2020. We have up to $50 million that's been appropriated to the Commission to fund low-carbon energy infrastructure enhancement and development grants. We've received $178 million in projects all across the state for that pot of up to $50 million and are currently working through those grant applications, should have decisions this spring. And then we were also tasked with a nuclear feasibility study last year, both in terms of the framework of the study and then funding for the study in the appropriations bill. That is ongoing. We're in the process of selecting an independent consultant to do that study, and we were given 18 months. So we need to turn that around by April of 2024. And then finally, we also provide support for Michigan Saves, which provides loan funds to people doing energy improvements in their homes and businesses. We started that program with funding from the Commission in 2009. And in recent years, the legislature has appropriated to us as a pass-through grant to Michigan Saves additional funding for their programs. And with that, I think I probably went longer than 25 minutes, but I'll wrap up and see what questions or discussion we have.
Thank you so much for that informative presentation. Are there any questions? The chair is going to recognize Rep. Altman.
Thank you, Chair Scott, and thank you, Chairman Scripps, for being here. I appreciated your meeting last week or the week prior. I forget when it was, but I encourage every member of the committee to meet with you and kind of learn about your role with the MPSC and how we can work together, especially some of the newer members on the committee. During your presentation, you mentioned reliability, and MISO recently stated that the grid is experiencing higher projected electricity use alongside reduced power supply. Now, do you agree with that statement, and how do you feel about the state of Michigan's energy future and what actions that we should be taking? You mentioned some of the actions that utilities are taking in terms of tree trimming and some other actions regarding that. But what are some of the legislative actions that we could be taking? You put the studies aside. We have a number of studies being conducted right now. Are there any concrete legislative actions that we should be pursuing right now, particularly with the House Energy Committee?
Yeah. I do agree with MISO's assessment. So we, at the grid scale, and this followed the 2003 outages that covered a lot of Michigan and then east, FERC created the federal regulators created the North American Energy Reliability Council, and they have worked to make sure that that never happens again. And their planning standard that they've put in place is that we should have grid scale reliability all but one day in 10 years. And so that is what groups like MISO and PJM plan for, that how do you have a system that's resilient, that has sufficient resources online to avoid grid scale outages all but one day in 10 years. And the reason, there's nothing magic about that, but it's you could try and make it that you never ever have an outage, but at some point you get to laws of diminishing returns, and the additional costs of adding additional redundancy and resilience in the system outweighs the benefit. And so they sort of settled on that as a compromise. What MISO told us last year is we're on the wrong side of that planning horizon, in part because of the accelerated retirement of resources and that we haven't added sort of similar resources or sufficient resources to back that up. And so that we're likely to have more than one day in 10 years. It's difficult to quantify, but we're on the wrong side of the planning horizon. And I think there is shared responsibility for that between MISO and the states within the footprint. So from MISO's perspective, I would highlight the interconnection queue needs to go faster. We have resources in the queue, and even adding a fraction of those resources in a timely fashion would get us back to the right side of the planning horizon. We also, and MISO deserves credit for this, need to make sure that we can move resources around the footprint. The truth is that it's North and Central MISO that are on the wrong side of the planning horizon. There are sufficient resources in the South, but there's insufficient transmission linkages between the subregions of MISO that would allow all of us then to take advantages of the resources that are available. And then the third thing that I'd highlight as a major thing is the market signals. Right now, MISO prices the value of capacity of having additional resources on the system at essentially zero up until the point that we're on the wrong side of the planning horizon, and then it jumps to a very high level. Having something like a sloped demand curve, which is something that MISO is currently considering, I think would provide additional compensation for existing resources before they retire, and could potentially change the economics of some of those retirement decisions, as well as the decisions of sort of when to add capacity, because it's not a boom or bust, all or nothing capacity payment. At the state level, I think we're actually doing a fairly good job, and when MISO comes in to testify, they regularly highlight the fact that they wish more states in the MISO footprint did what Michigan does. And I think the two things that stand out for them are our integrated resource plans that require consideration of a broad range of factors, but including resource adequacy, and making sure that we're making decisions that don't do sort of damage to our reliability position. And then the capacity demonstrations that were also included in the 2016 reforms that require all providers, not just utilities, but also the alternative electric suppliers and the municipal and cooperative utilities, to show that they have adequate resources 4 years into the future to serve expected demand. And the reason the 4 years was chosen by the legislature is that it provides a length of time that if you thought you were going to be short, you can bring additional resources on between now and 4 years from now in order to make sure that we're resource adequate at that point. So there's probably more that can be done, but I believe that our framework is fairly solid. It's tweaks, not overhauls, I would say, and love to sort of have conversations about what those might look like.
Yeah, very good, and I appreciate the response, and I look forward to discussing this further with you. I'm going to need some clarification on some of those things that you highlighted. Energy is, as you know, is just so incredibly complex.
I learn every day.
As do I. So I do appreciate your response, and I'm not looking to blame anybody. We're all in this together, and appreciate you being here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Chair recognizes Representative McFall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a quick question under your energy assurance and planning section. When you mentioned that the lack of timely propane data hampers emergency response, you mentioned about it going to the federal government. Is that the delay? Is that it has to funnel through them first?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in a word, yes. So there are a number of forms that are required by the federal government. So prime supplier sales, this would come from your Valero's, Sunoco's, Ferrellgas, Shell, Exxon. There's a monthly refinery report from groups like Marathon, a monthly bulk terminal report, so Plains, Sunoco, DCP Midstream, some of the propane terminal operators, and then natural gas liquids report, again, Plains, Lambda up in Kalkaska, et cetera. And so these 4 reports get sent to the Federal Energy Information Administration. And then at some point, we get to see them. The problem is, and I'll take propane for an example because we spend a lot of time, even though we don't regulate it, thinking about it. And I come from Northern Michigan. I was on the UP Energy Task Force. It's a front of mind issue for a lot of the folks that I have worked with over the years, is that there can be price spikes and challenges in getting product to market that have a pretty negative impact. And sometimes it's as simple as the length of time that you have to stand in line at the Marysville terminal or at Rapid River in order to fill up your propane truck and then bring it to your retail facility and then load the trucks that then ultimately deliver to end-use customers. But there are driver hours that if you're more than a certain number of hours in your truck, and for important safety reasons, you need to take a break. There are times that under the energy emergency rules, we can waive or extend those driver hour of operation requirements. But we need better market transparency to understand when we're approaching some sort of disruptive event that might require that. So getting those same we're not asking for additional information, we're asking for the same information that providers already provide to the federal government to provide it at the state level as well to give us greater situational awareness when emergencies are coming.
So when it goes to the government, do they do something with the data that and then give it back to you, or can you get it at the same time? Like if they could just
No, it's always been a problem, and it's one that's getting worse. So they for important reasons, they take the data from individual providers and then they aggregate it to protect sort of competitive information. But the time that it takes them to do that and then to get it to us makes it's not a real time. It's been 6 months. It's getting longer than that. And if you're facing a challenge in February on getting propane out to customers and you get the information in August, it's not all that helpful.
Right.
And I would say we do the same thing when we do a weekly propane survey of retailers. And then we take that information. We have a guy on our staff who literally calls propane retailers all across the state and asks them their pricing. And then we take that and we bundle it and then we post it on our website. So you get a sense of where the market is overall, but without looking at individual prices from individual propane retailers to protect some of that sort of sensitive information from a competition standpoint. So we do the same thing, but we do it at the retail level. We'd like to be able to better understand the wholesale level in real time to avoid disruptions.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I also appreciate the meeting that we had last week, going over some of the things that you guys do. So, and I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Representative Andrews.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. Extremely informative. I just had a question around the local municipal permitting process. Would you mind explaining that process a little bit? If under the current framework, if you think our utilities are on track to meet their renewable standards, and if not, what can change to make that work a little better?
Sure. To take maybe the second part, the utilities have met their requirements of getting 15% of their energy from renewable resources by 2025, or by 2021, apologies. So the sort of standard included in law is we're done and they have met that. In terms of the continued growth, and that can be fueled either by sort of changes in law or by voluntary procurements. We've seen the 2 largest renewable energy deals through a utility in U.S. history in the last year with Ford and Stellantis and DTE. or by looking at the optimal level of renewables in comparison to other resources that then gets reflected in the integrated resource plans. There are challenges. The My Healthy Climate Plan highlighted siting as one of the two biggest challenges, I think, in terms of meeting expanded renewable energy deployment in the state. I think there are probably multiple solutions. There can be sort of budget and incentive solutions, and there may be elements of that are included in sort of what the governor rolls out later today. Other states have approached this in different ways, and so I think it is an issue to be solved, and I think we want to be constructive in what that looks like, but I wouldn't say there's sort of a one-size-fits-all way of addressing the challenge.
You would say that this is something that needs to be addressed if we're going to continue making progress?
I think the siting challenges are real, and they will get in the way of achieving our goals.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Burns.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation this morning. My question is with regards to slide 15, setting just and reasonable rates. Mr. Scripps, you mentioned the My Healthy Climate Plan and this expectation that equity with regard to the rate structure be built in so as not to place an undue burden on our residents who have limited financial means. Can you talk to us about how you see the commission kind of managing the tension between that expectation and then the cost of service principles, and if there are any best practices from other states, who might have found themselves in a similar situation that you could model your work after?
I would love for there to be a plug-and-play solution set. I think we are candidly at the forefront of states that are wrestling with this and have been for a number of years. And have approached it in a couple of ways. So foundationally and statutorily, our rates need to reflect cost of service. There have been arguments raised in cases that, and again, I can't talk about cases in front of us, so I'm only talking about past cases, but arguments that the cost to serve lower income customers can be less than higher income customers, largely based on air conditioning load, that the contribution to the overall summer peaks of lower income customers who often don't have sort of central air or the air conditioning load of higher income customers might provide a basis for why that could be adjusted to reflect that. Something like a payment of or percentage of income payment program we have adopted through settlement agreements where the parties sort of outside of the commission, with commission staff, but also outside parties, the utilities and other interveners, have agreed to this among themselves. And we found that the settlement on a whole met the basis of approval in terms of the statutes that we use in considering, evaluating, and ultimately approving settlement agreements. So that has given us an option to maybe be more flexible than we would be able to do through orders itself. It continues to be an issue. I guess the last thing that I'd say is for a number of years we've worked to try and integrate energy waste reduction or energy efficiency with assistance programs and with efforts to support low-income customers, not just providing a one-time Band-Aid for the energy bill that's right in front of them, but how can we qualify them for measures that ultimately reduce their overall energy consumption and energy bill. And I think we've had some success with that and continue to sort of think holistically about how these pieces fit together, both in the rate setting context, but also in the customer assistance and energy waste reduction context.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Looking forward to continuing that conversation. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Rep. Aragona.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Scripps, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. I kind of have a bit of a freshman question for you. On slide 6, I noticed that the 90%, that is investor-owned companies specifically. So is that, that's equity shareholders? Those companies must have equity shareholders?
No, it's, sorry, I was not clear here. It's actually not just for investor-owned utilities. Cooperatives and Representative Preston, I encourage you to correct me if I get this wrong. I believe also have a 10% choice allocation. I think municipals do as well. The investor-owned utilities are ones that do have equity shareholders. So that's the consumers, DTE, SEMCO, Indiana Michigan Power. Alpena, Northern States Power at the far western end of the UP, UPCO, and the Upper Michigan Energy Resources Corporation, or UMERC. Those are the 7 investor-owned electric utilities to whom this applies. But I believe it also applies to co-ops and municipal utilities as well.
So is there a limit on, or is there a threshold on the number of investors or the percentage that somebody can own of the shares of that particular company? And I guess kind of where I'm going with this, just to lead you there right away, you said that there's court decisions and there's certain business decisions that you can't make for these companies. But if one of them wanted to do some type of stock buyback, would they have to run that by you? Would they have to get approval? How does that work when you're looking at the finance side of these companies?
So on the management piece of that, including the financial management, we are not involved. If it gets to a level that it becomes a transfer of the utility, then that does require approval from us. And so that has happened twice in the last 10 years involving UPCO, that they were sold to one utility and then 2 years ago, I think, sold to one company and then sold to a different private equity group. So they are owned by a private equity organization. Most others, DTE, Consumers, et cetera, are owned by individual shareholders. And so if it gets to a point of it's the sale of the company, that sale requires commission approval. But the other financial management decisions we are not involved in.
And what's that threshold? So is it a majority of shares, or, I mean, like 40% would obviously be an influence, but it's not the majority.
Right. No, I think it is. I need to get back to you in terms of the specifics, but it is sort of transfer of ownership and what constitutes a transfer of ownership. We also have in our code of conduct provisions relating to business transactions between affiliates, and those are specified as well in terms of what creates an affiliate relationship between the regulated electric utility and maybe one of its non-regulated business units.
Gotcha. Okay. And then on slide 7, if you can, and this is my last question, if you can just speak to what was any change in rate between 2007 and 2021? Is there any type of delta that you've noticed through the rates?
It's a great question. I mean, so the overall rates that customers have paid have gone up from 2007. When you disaggregate the amount that's paid for power versus the investments in the underlying grid infrastructure, it's a more complicated story. What we've seen in large part is that the addition of fuel-free resources when they dispatch into the market, they basically say, I'll dispatch at 0 because my incremental cost is 0 as long as I'm available. They're not always available, of course, but that has had a suppressing effect on overall market prices. And we've seen a decrease in generation costs because of the increase in zero marginal cost units over the last several of years. But that's been more than offset by the increase in the underlying sort of infrastructure investments.
So, so rates have gone up mainly due to investment in infrastructure, whether it's generation or otherwise.
I think that's an accurate statement, yes.
Okay. And it is safe to say that since there is a 90% rule, I would assume that these companies would, if they're equity financing, that's going to be barely above the risk-free rate. That's going to be a very safe investment for investors, so they're not going to be asking as much of a premium on that stock, as well as debt financing. I mean, that seems like a pretty safe investment, so they're going to be paying very little on investment.
These are the most contested issues in our rate cases.
Okay.
We spend a lot of time on it. But when we set rates, it is trying to balance the sort of need for investment in the system and the opportunity, not guarantee, but opportunity to earn a fair rate of return. And so like opportunity, fair, all of those things, you can spend a lot of time arguing about what that is. We look at where we've been, we look at peer utilities, we look at a range of other factors in our rate setting efforts, including not only the overall return on equity, but the weighted average cost of capital, which is determined by the blend between how much equity and how much debt, which is close to 50-50 for most investor-owned utilities, but there are variations that matter a lot.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Chair recognizes Representative Hill.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan, Chairman, for the terrific presentation. I'm really looking forward to our conversations going forward on the committee. I want to follow up on the rates question because, as folks are going to learn, the Upper Peninsula pays the highest electric rates in the lower 48. And as the representative for the Central UP, that is a significant concern to my constituents. I would like to, if you could discuss some, in addition to the question of the rates going up, there's the differentiation between industrial rates and residential rates and how that is structured differently. And so the question of which category of ratepayers are paying the higher rates at this time?
Sure. So up to 2014, and I don't know when up to starts, but recent memory, but up to 2014, there was some cross-subsidization between rate classes where having had the benefit of a large manufacturing base, we had made policy decisions that we were okay with having industrials pay a little more so that residential customers could pay a little less. I think the challenges of global competition and the margins for manufacturing companies called into question whether that was something that we wanted to continue. And in 2014, the legislature enacted what is called de-skewing, which removed the cross subsidies between rate classes and required that each customer class paid its full freight. So again, industrials pay for industrial costs, in commercial customers pay the full commercial costs, and residential pay the full residential costs. In effect, this had the impact of reducing industrial rates and increasing residential rates. When you look at benchmarks across the Midwest and across the country, we're about on average, maybe a little better on industrial rates. We're almost right on average in terms of commercial rates, and we're higher than average for residential rates. And then the last thing that I'd say on this is that not all industrial customers have the same profile. And so I mentioned this during the presentation, but last year we approved additional tariffs for both DTE and consumers for large industrial customers that they were seeking to attract to Michigan. And for new load that had a high load factor, that operations that were large and ran all the time, essentially, we felt that it was reflective of cost of service principles that those customers paid less because they imposed lower costs on the overall system. That had the effect of making us more competitive in conversations with some of the folks looking, or at least considering locating in Michigan. And I know that that shift has put us in the game for some of the economic development projects that are being evaluated today.
If I follow up, so I think there's significant questions then when you pair the reliability question with the higher residential rate question for both the Upper Peninsula and particularly Southeast Michigan, and the fact that folks are paying a higher amount but are not getting the same level of service, and that's a concern. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
Yeah, and I think continuing to look at what rates are and ensuring that they are reasonable and prudent and reflecting cost of service, and then the significant work that we've been doing on reliability. And again, this goes back multiple iterations of the commission, but one thing, for example, in 2019, as part of the DTE rate case, they were approved to increase the amount of tree trimming that they were doing, but then those dollars were ring-fenced, so they could only be spent on tree trimming with additional guarantees of recovery through a securitization process that is ultimately less costly to customers. So more affordable focus on reliability, greater certainty of recovery, but only for that purpose that the commission at that time wanted to sort of highlight. And I think that approach of trying to consider the most cost-effective ways to improve our reliability position is one that's carried through the storm orders and ultimately into the third-party audit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for, yes? Representative Preston, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Scripps. Quick question. What's been the trend over the last couple of years on Max Gen events?
Yep. So, MISO, the grid operator, can call what are called Max Gen events, where they essentially say we need all available resources that can be dispatched in the market to run, because we're facing a grid scale energy shortage. And the trend has been that they've been increasing. I think it goes back to Representative Outman's question as well, that there's no question that we're facing more significant challenges than we have. I will also say that the 2019 statewide energy assessment came out of one of those Max Gen events. And at the end of the day, it was a success story. As close as we came, we continued to deliver electricity and heat to homes and businesses. And there's some flexibility with demand response and curtailment tariffs, as you know, where companies typically agree to be curtailable or to have their energy reduced in exchange for a cheaper rate. We see it in the residential rate in context in things like air conditioning control programs and the like. But it's largely for large companies who say, when you get to a Max Gen event, when you need every megawatt hour that you possibly can get, we're willing to be curtailed in that event in exchange for a cheaper rate sort of day to day. And so I think we need to be considering both the demand side and the supply side in terms of how we balance the overall system needs. But to directly answer your question, we've seen a pretty significant increase in Max Gen events.
So with the Max Gen events increasing frequency, have you seen a correlation of reserve margins also dwindling?
Yes. I mean, I think those are related.
And one of the things that I'm having a hard time squaring up is how does that affect, you know, our trend towards the EV market? Mm-hmm. I see a logjam coming in. I just want to see what you guys have in store as far as to approach that.
I think there are two stories that you could tell there. One is that, I mean, we're seeing significant EV adoption, 10% globally, I think 6% across the U.S. We recently got debriefed by both consumers and DTE, who are seeing trends that would put us above the level of penetration by 2025, even of like the clean car states. And so we're seeing adoption in Michigan, and that will require additional grid resources, which could exacerbate the issues. And I think that's the concern that you're flagging. I think the other story that you can tell is that those same resources can play a sort of grid balancing function, that even second to second, that to ride out sort of variability in voltage issues, but also being able to charge at night, for example, where we have surpluses of energy, cheaper energy, and tariffs then to encourage that. A lot of utilities have adopted those to try and ensure that the addition of those vehicles is actually grid beneficial and not exacerbating the challenges. I think it's up to us to figure out how that story ends. And my hope is that we can leverage the benefits of increased adoption, not only to electrify transportation, but also to provide grid services and address some of the grid challenges that we're facing with. But if we do it the wrong way, I think we could be in the soup.
Yeah, and that's what we're facing up in the UP. We're behind the times as far as like our RF metering system is just getting underway. It puts us behind the eight ball as far as, you know, catching up to what's coming.
Yeah.
And you can see it in the graph.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for that informative presentation, Mr. Scripps,
Thank you.
and answering all the committee's questions. Thank you. With there being no further business before the committee is adjourned.